So you're all very welcome here today on behalf of the Centre for Sustainability, Equality and Climate Action. I'm John Barry, Professor of Green Political Economy here at the University, and I'll be chairing today's session given by an external speaker from TASC, Task Force for Action on Social Change, Kieran Harrahill. Although it will embarrass him, could I just publicly acknowledge that Callum McGill, one of our PhD candidates here, should have been having his PhD viva today, but because of the intransigence of our management, we've been forced as academic staff to engage in a marking and assessment boycott for arguing for the radical idea of people not stealing our pensions and to give us at least an inflation equalising wage increase, which hasn't happened. And unfortunately, Callum has been one of the casualties of it. So I just want to publicly acknowledge that we are in industrial action. We've been forced to do so because of the unreasonableness in our view of management, and just to acknowledge that Callum has been very supportive of this, including in facilitating today's online discussion. So I'll load everybody's online. So today we're delighted to welcome Kieran to talk about an issue that we were just chatting before we started the event, that the island of Ireland is unique in the context of the climate crisis, in particular, in that our largest sector for greenhouse gas emissions is not, as it is in other countries, energy or transport, although they're still quite big. From my memory, the greenhouse gas emission profile of Northern Ireland is about 27% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture and land use. To the extent that the Committee on Climate Change, which is the UK's kind of critical friend to government on climate change issues, its research has shown that, again, uniquely, and again, Kieran might correct me whether or not this is the same in the Republic, but in Northern Ireland, our agri-food and land use sector is a net producer of carbon. In most other places in Europe, the land use sector is a net absorber of carbon, so therefore that's a challenge, but also an opportunity, particularly for our agri-food communities in Northern Ireland. If we switch to down south, as I look, it's over 40%, is it 42 or so percent that of greenhouse gas, so it's even greater down south. And this raises lots of challenges in terms of it has to be dealt with. We are now in the process, as many of you might know if you follow what's happening in Northern Ireland, we now have a Climate Change Act. Hooray. We're no longer the only place, I think, in Western Europe without climate change legislation. And the carbon budgets are now being developed by DERA, Department for Agriculture, so Environment, Agriculture and Rural Affairs. And that's going to lead to very interesting issues, which I'm sure Kieran will touch upon, in terms of, because agriculture takes up such a large proportion of greenhouse gas emissions north and south, what then is going to be the equal and just distribution of the burden and opportunities as we move towards a more low carbon, climate resilient food system. So Kieran is currently a PhD candidate in University College Dublin, my old alma mater, where I was back many years ago in the 1980s. I'm showing my age now, so hopefully it's still as nice as it was back then. Kieran is a senior researcher with TASC, with a special interest in climate justice, but as I say, particularly important because of the unique features of this island, north and south, in terms of how do we develop and hopefully dialogue with our farming communities and the various stakeholders in that community and the production of food. I mean, it's one thing to contemplate living in a post-industrial society. We can never ever contemplate a post-agricultural one. So how do we, include our farming communities in that conversation and policy around a just transition? So I'm going to ask you to put your hands together and online virtually and welcome Kieran. Kieran did very well.
Start off with a little bit of an introduction. I think John has done everything about it. So I'm a senior researcher in climate justice with TASC, the think tank for action on social change. So TASC covers a wide range of areas, including housing, health, social inequality, as well as climate justice. And the ultimate ambition of TASC as an independent non-government organisation is to address inequality, sustain democracy, and translate analysis into action. So Alongside working with TASC, I'm also completing a PhD with University College Dublin, as well as CHAGIS, which is the Irish Agriculture and Food Development Authority, and BioRbic, the National Bioeconomy Research Centre in Dublin. The focus of my PhD study has been looking at a concept called bioeconomy, which I'll talk about a little bit more later on in this presentation, and understand its potential to support a just transition for bee farmers. So I suppose in terms of the title for today's discussion, a just transition for avoiding agriculture versus the environment divide in Ireland. The reason that I use those phrases, agriculture versus the environment, is that when you look at the original literature on just transition, it talks about jobs versus the environment, the potential for a perceived divide between workers whose incomes are dependent on pollution practices such as peat production, coal mining, oil, gas, and so forth, and the interests of climate activists in terms of moving away from these pollution practices. So I suppose the interest I have in this area is the potential for the just transition to ensure that rather than there being a divide between the interests of farmers on one hand and the interests of climate activists on the other hand, that their joint interests can come together and we can create solutions which address both of these needs. In terms of the agenda, or what I'll talk about in today's discussion, it'll be broken into three sections. So the first section will provide a background to the overall concept of the just transition, its development over recent years, and its position within policy over recent years. After that, I will provide some contextual background to agriculture, and in particular the bee sector in the Republic of Ireland, which I've been focusing on. After this, I will provide an overview of my PhD research study. The title of my PhD is A Farmer-Centred Approach to Understanding Ireland's Bioeconomy in the Context of Just Transition. And then to wrap up this discussion, I'll talk about the work I'm now completing with TASC on climate justice, and at the centre of this is the idea of the People's Transition Initiative. So I suppose just to start off, maybe to give you a little bit of background about myself, I'm from a beef farm in County Tipperary. So Tipperary is roughly halfway between Dublin City and Cork City in the south of Ireland. What got me interested in the area of climate justice might be a little bit different from other people. So I'm a sports fan, a picture of Alex Ferguson, very important to Manchester United. Why I show this picture is the taller guy you can see there is a German goalkeeper called Manuel Neuer. So Manuel Neuer now plays for Bayern Munich, but before that he played for a team called Schalke in Gelsenkirchen. So Gelsenkirchen is in the region of North Rhine-Westphalia, which is right to the west of Germany. And that has been an area where coal mining has traditionally been a key sector of employment for many communities, particularly Gelsenkirchen. Why I showed this image is that back around 2011, when I was 15, there was a program on, and Manuel Neuer was talking about his background, where he grew up, and so on and so on. And there was an image of all the derelict collieries, and it was, I think, a really powerful image in terms of what happens when a sector like coal mining, when it goes into decline, when those jobs are lost, what's left for those communities. So I suppose to kind of drive on a couple of years afterwards, I was completing an undergraduate in geography and politics in UCD, and I was in my final year in 2016 when the 2016 presidential election in the US happened. And in her book, What Happened, by Hillary Clinton, when she spoke about how she lost the presidential election, she said that her greatest mistake was saying that she was going to put so many coal miners out of work. And the outcome of that is, as you can see, it led to support for Donald Trump, a political figure who was supportive of the fossil fuel industry. I think that was a great example whereby if you try to apply climate action in a manner without considering what would be the impacts for communities, if it's a very top-down approach whereby you fail to consider what are the concerns that people may face, particularly when it comes to something like regional communities where there may be fewer opportunities for other areas of employment, it could lead to a scenario similar to the 1980s in Britain, where communities are left behind, that there is a lack of support, and that it leads to support for politicians who are opposed to climate action, climate skeptics, and so on. So I suppose this all led me to my interest in just transition, and I completed a master's in environmental policy, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. But just to start off, what exactly is a just transition? So there's differences in opinion in terms of what impacts will a move to a greener society have on employment and job opportunities. So on the one hand, there may be a scenario where in the Midlands of Ireland, Ford which is a peat producer similar to coal mining to some extent, was a major source of employment in a regional economy or a rural economy where there were a few other opportunities. There is the view that moving away from fossil fuels will cause serious, I suppose, economic and social impacts, such as increased levels of unemployment, a reduction in municipal income, which will impact local services. On the other hand, there is the view that a move towards greener sources of production and consumption will actually lead to new types of employment, new types of job opportunities. There's the quote, however, which I think is really striking, is that transition is inevitable, justice is not. So while we as a society may move to a greener economy, there is the risk that certain groups will be left behind and they will be the ones who lose out from this transition. In terms of how we can address the move to a more sustainable economy in a manner that is fair, the idea of a just transition is very interesting. The basic premise of a just transition is that a move towards more sustainable practices should take place in a manner which is equitable, inclusive, and fair. And as Sean McCabe, my predecessor in TASC, described, for a transition to a more sustainable society to be fast, it must be fair. For it to be enduring, it must be inclusive. And in order for a transition to benefit from wide-scale public support, the opportunities and the challenges must be shared equitably. I suppose this logic was very similar to what was described by Frans Timmermans, who's the Vice President of the European Commission, when they described how a transition must be a just transition or there will be no transition at all. As I'll talk about in a few minutes, the idea of a just transition has been, I suppose, in the works for a couple of years. One paper which was very influential for me was a paper which came from 1998, which looked at that idea of a just transition. So how do we, I suppose, particularly in the United States context, how can issues like environmental policy and trade negotiations, how can they be undertaken in a manner which does not leave communities behind or makes sure that workers are not the ones who lose out? So just transition has been described by Sinead Garcia, one of the pioneers of just transition in the Republic of Ireland, as a new and emerging concept. There's, however, I suppose, a difference of opinion within literature. So, for example, one paper by Galcosi describes how the 1960s is the starting point of just transition. Sean McCabe, previously TASC, describes how the 1970s and the trade union movement in the United States was the real starting point of just transition. Similarly, another researcher in the Republic of Ireland, Sabrina Decker, describes how the introduction of policies to combat air and water pollution in the US and Canada in the 1980s was the starting point for the just transition. And the 1980s are also referenced by Reeves Long, another researcher from the Republic, who described how the impact of the climate, impact of coal mine closures in the UK in the 1980s is a key reason why just transition is vital. So the experiences of those communities are not replicated. So while there might be differences of opinion in terms of when just transition came about, there has been growth in the emphasis on a just transition over recent years, particularly in the area of policy. And a great example of that is within the Paris Climate Agreement, which describes how signatory countries must account for the imperatives of a just transition in terms of creating decent work and quality jobs in accordance with nationally defined development priorities. So, of course, it's excellent that there's a growing focus on just transition within policy decision making. There is, however, the risk that just transition could become similar to sustainability in terms of it's a buzzword which is thrown around without much of a meaning. And in a paper by Heffron and Macaulay, they outline the need to understand what exactly does justice mean within just transition. So within this graph, you can see that there are 7 concepts of just transitions. This comes from work by Reeves Long and Bastos Lima, who works with the Stockholm Environment Institute. So first of all, procedural justice focuses on how decisions are made essentially. So whose voices, whose opinions, whose experience are considered within climate action and policies relating to climate action, and how are decision-making processes set up in terms of whether they are fair and inclusive or if they take an exclusionary approach. Distributional justice focuses on the distribution of the opportunities and challenges relating to climate action. So will it only be those from a well-to-do background or income who might be able to benefit from retrofitting, might be able to benefit from electric vehicles and so on, and then people on lower incomes will be impacted by increases in carbon taxes and so forth. Environmental justice focuses on protection from climate change, protection from the impacts of climate change in terms of floods, extreme weather events, and so forth. Aligned with this is climate justice, which focuses on climate action from a human rights perspective in terms of who has rights and who has not rights, and how may that impact people's ability to adapt to climate change. Energy justice, something which is extremely relevant given the cost of living crisis we're facing in terms of having equal access to affordable energy, particularly energy which comes from greener sources. Restorative justice focuses on consent and reconciliation in terms of how do we address previous damages. So I know the COP last year, there was a focus on ensuring that communities, particularly in the developing world, will be provided with funding needed to adapt to climate change. And then the final type of justice considered is intergenerational justice in terms of how climate action or climate change may impact older members of the community, how it will impact younger people and future generations who are not yet born. So while this is a wide range of ideas of justice have been considered here, there are also other factors to consider. So as the focus of this seminar is on agriculture, food justice is something which is very relevant in terms of having access to affordable food, transport justice in terms of if you're in an urban community, you may have better access to public transport compared to places particularly like west of the Ban and Donegal and so forth, where the opportunities for public transport may not be as great. One of the big developments over recent years has been the adoption of the European Green Deal by the European Union in 2019. So there are a number of positives within the European Green Deal. So first of all, it focuses on transforming the EU to a fair and prosperous society with a modern, resource-efficient and competitive economy. It also outlines the need for transitioning to a sustainable future, which is socially just and inclusive, as well as providing Just Transition Fund, which is worth 7.5 billion euros in the Republic of Ireland, the Midlands region, which have been dependent on peat production and fossil fuel employment, are one of the main beneficiaries of this. So while there are a lot of positives, and it's great to see that there's a growing emphasis on climate action, there are also a number of limitations within the European Green Deal. So first of all, the green jobs which the European Green Deal could create may not be substitutional for those which are lost. So, for example, within green employment, there may be necessity for college degrees and so forth. And if you were one of the workers in the Irish Midlands who worked, suppose, in a skills employment job for 20 or 30 years, you may not have the qualifications or the skills, and that leads to the issue of cost of retraining, as well as the issue of if you are almost at retirement age but not there yet, will you be able to have the support which is needed? Another stated limitation of the Green Deal is that it doesn't really focus on sectors which do not have a traditional trade union activity. So one of the examples of this is within agriculture. One of the criticisms or the arguments for this is that agriculture is a central element within European governance and decision making, and for this reason there may be a limitation on the part of decision makers to alter the status quo. This is something I'll speak a little bit more about in a few minutes. The final critique is that the European Green Deal does not address changes in employment models, changes in labour practices, or changes in the concentration of power in terms of, to think broadly, how's the economy structured and who are the ones who benefit from the economy. So while Just Transition, and as I mentioned, Just Transition considers a wide range of issues, and there are a number of criticisms or comments on Just Transition in terms of where further consideration is needed. So the first of these is that Just Transition must consider a wider range of topics rather than just focusing on moving from fossil-based economy to a green economy and workers are supported. There is the argument that Just Transition must also consider issues like racism, zero waste, gentrification, and Indigenous rights. While there's no one agreed universal definition of a just transition, there is the view that there are different types of just transitions. So there may be an incremental just transition whereby there's a focus on moving from fossil fuels to a greener economy, but that the structure of the economy and the position of workers within the economy is retained. Alternatively, there is a view that a more transformative understanding of the just transition in terms of addressing what is the role of the state, which is very relevant post-COVID-19, what is the role of capital, and what is the role of labour also. So this is something which is of interest, particularly when, as I mentioned in a few minutes, when we think about what exactly is the role of farmers within agricultural value chains. I suppose in terms of my own contribution to the area of just transition, I completed my master's in UCD in 2018, and published a paper based on my thesis with my colleague, Dr. Owen Douglas of UCD, in the journal Energy Policy. My study looked at 3 communities, 3 regions who had been dependent on coal mining for generations and how they were supported in the move away from coal mining. So the 3 regions were North Rhine-Westphalia in Germany, the region I mentioned earlier, Victoria in Australia, and Alberta in Canada. So using indicators which came from the European Trade Union Institute, my colleague Owen Douglas and I looked at 4 factors which must be considered within the application of a just transition. So the first of these is social dialogue. So what was of interest was, is it only central government and businesses who have the ability to influence the transition away from fossil fuels? Or is there a role for workers through their representatives and trade unions, as well as local governments who are dependent on these sources of income for municipal services? Do they have a role in influencing the timeline and decisions which are made within a just transition? The second indicator to consider is re-employment. So what are the new types of jobs which will replace those which are being replaced from fossil fuels? As well as this, and I'll talk about a little bit more, when we think about agriculture, are alternative ways of using land necessary in terms of providing sustainable income streams to farmers? Aligned with this is retraining in terms of what are the new types of skills which might be needed for workers or perhaps farmers to participate in these new practices. And then the final indicator is government support. So this relates to, I suppose, an individual element in terms of providing compensation to workers, as well as focusing on, I suppose, more regional approach in terms of the provision of infrastructure. I'm going to move on now to what is the focus of my PhD study, and I suppose the focus of today's discussion in terms of agriculture. So agriculture is a type of economic sector which is of extreme importance to both national but particularly regional economies. So as you can see, in 2017, agriculture generated 110 billion euro within the EU food chain, and 44 million people were employed within the value chain. I suppose similar to research on just transition, which highlights the importance of coal mining to a region's identity, agriculture is viewed as a type of employment or a practice which is integral to a person's identity, to their family's identity, as well as to communities. So while agriculture is important to rural areas, there are also a number of challenges facing sectors, particularly within the beef sector in the Republic of Ireland, which I'm going to speak about. So to provide a little bit of context to beef farming in Ireland, the Republic of Ireland is the 5th largest beef exporter in the world and is the largest beef exporter within the European Union. In terms of looking beyond the farm gate, there are 13,000 people employed within the beef sector and the value chains within the Republic of Ireland, and 1.5 billion euro is spent by cattle farmers on agricultural products. So this leads to the view within a number of studies that the Republic of Ireland is a specialist within beef production. Also, I suppose think about the national level, but particularly at the regional level, when you look at the west of Ireland, 81% of all cows are used in the suckler herd, so for the production of beef. And that contrasts with the southwest of Ireland, when you look at Cork, Kerry, moving towards Tipperary and Limerick, where only 22% of cows are used for the suckler sector. The vast majority of cows there are used in the dairy sector, which is a more profitable type of farming, particularly in the Republic of Ireland. So while the beef sector is important, I suppose, economically from a national level, it is unsustainable from an economic perspective at the farm level. So from a report by Tennessee et al. In 2018, they defined how only 20% of beef farmers within the Republic of Ireland are economically viable. The majority of that is due to off-farm employment. 40% of beef farms are categorized as sustainable, while 40% are no longer viable. So the best example or the best illustration of that is that direct subsidies are worth 158% of beef farmers' income. So what that means is 158%. The outcome of that is that beef farmers actually lose money from producing beef. So the average beef farm income is somewhere between 9,000 euros and 14,000 euros, which means that beef farmers actually lose money from the production of beef, and there is a dependence on government subsidies. Another factor which needs to be considered is the value chain of beef farming in Ireland. So there is a small number of beef processors who determine about 65% of the kill price in the Republic of Ireland. So the phrase which is often used by farmers is that they are price takers, not price makers, whereby they are dependent on the prices which they receive from beef processors in order to sustain their income. I suppose to speak a little bit about, and I'll talk about this a little bit later on in one of my published papers, there is the view that those small numbers of beef processors are essentially a cartel whereby they are able to determine the price which beef farmers receive. And that led to the undertaking of protests in 2019 with beef farmers. And as I mentioned, I'll speak a little bit more about that in a few moments. So as mentioned earlier, agriculture has an impact on environmental degradation both at a global level and at a national level as well. I think a quote there which really reflects what I just mentioned in terms of the challenges which beef farmers are facing from an income perspective and the wider issue of climate action is that it's hard to be green when you're in the red. If farmers are not making a sustainable income, it'll be very challenging for them to adapt practices which may, suppose, have a financial cost on what I said, but also have an impact in terms of having to change practices, particularly if they feel that there's a lack of support. So, as has been mentioned in many forms before, agriculture is a producer of methane and a number of other gases. And as you can see from this graphic here from 2016, agriculture was responsible for around 10% of EU greenhouse gas emissions in 2016. However, as you can see from the Republic of Ireland, there was about over 30% of emissions was coming from the agriculture sector, and it's roughly 1/3, I think, currently. So on the one hand, there is the argument that a reason why agriculture is such a high proportion of greenhouse gas emissions from the Republic of Ireland is that, unlike other EU member states, Ireland doesn't have much of a heavy industry within the country. A counter-argument to that is the reason why emissions are so high within the Republic of Ireland is from policy measures that have been taken, particularly with the expansion of the dairy sector, as well as the growth of, I suppose, the impact. At a global scale, agriculture also has a number of impacts at the localized level, such as water quality, biodiversity loss, land degradation, and air quality. So while there is an impact from agriculture on the environment, there are a number of reasons why farmers may not be in a position where they're able to adapt to more sustainable practices. So in their study, looking at agriculture in the United States, Hauser et al. Described how farmers are unable to adapt due to the structural conditions of capitalist production. A similar line is spoken of within the study by Richards et al., which looked at agriculture in Australia. They described how farmers are stuck on an agricultural treadmill, whereby in order for them to receive that sustainable income, they must intensify, and that means that they have to, say, for example, introduce a greater level of inputs on their farms, such as the use of fertilizers, and that then has a further impact on emission creation on farms. That is an example of how agriculture is both a culprit but also a victim of climate change in terms of the risk which farmers face when you look at things like extreme rainfall, when you look at drought, and how that impacts value chains and the income which farmers receive. So something which I think is very interesting in terms of agriculture in the beef sector in the Republic of Ireland, and this study by Stock et al. From New Zealand, is that a number of farmers within New Zealand who are active in sheep and beef farming moved towards dairy farming, and it represented a way of staying in agriculture. This, however, has come at a number of costs. So dairy farming is a far more physically intensive type of agriculture, which requires greater time constraints upon farmers, as well as, I suppose, the difficulties which farmers may face from a labour perspective in terms of greater hours which they have to work. There's also the environmental impact in terms of greater levels of effluent being produced on farms. One of the arguments in terms of retaining beef production within Ireland is that a reduction in the herd or reduction in beef production would lead to a scenario of carbon leakage, whereby a reduction in beef production in Ireland would increase beef production in other countries with a less sustainable approach to agriculture, such as Brazil. The counter-argument in that, which is provided by Kieran et al., is that expanding beef production to meet global demand would further impact environmental degradation at the local level. So in terms of something which I think is very relevant is the view that agriculture or the interests of farmers are not being heard by decision makers, and that is impacting farmers' perspectives of climate policy. So one example of this is from Richards et al., which looked at agriculture in Australia, and they described how farmers feel like they have been abandoned by governments as their focus moves from traditional rural and agricultural practices towards green interests. What's really interesting is, again, focusing on just transition, its relevance to coal mining and extractive industries, as well as its relevance to agriculture, is that those comments are very similar to what took place in Hazelwood in Victoria, which is one of the communities which I focused on my paper on just transition coal mining. So from this quote, you can see that ENGIE, which is a French multinational, they closed coal-powered energy plants at very short notice a number of years ago. And this led the National Minister for the Environment in Australia, who's a member of the Conservative Coalition, to describe how energy had been driven out of town by the ideological approach by the regional Labour government that traded away blue-collar jobs in the regions to win green votes in the city. So I think these quotes, I think, are very interesting when we think about the potential for politicians of a conservative climate skeptic perspective to try and position agriculture or coal mining as being opposed to climate policy, or that there is, I suppose, a zero-sum game in terms of if there's a greater level of climate action, that there will be losers, such as workers and farmers. And I think that underlines the necessity of a just transition. The final quote, or the final statement here, comes from a recently published paper on the bioeconomy, which I'll speak about in a few minutes, which describes how climate policy has failed to consider spatial uniqueness in terms of how will climate policy impact urban communities and rural communities differently, and how a failure to apply climate policy in a manner which is bottom-up, which addresses community needs and addresses issues facing communities, may lead to potential for resentment-based politics. So in terms of the area of just transition and agriculture, it's a small but growing area of research. So one of the main studies which have been published, which looks at the application of the just transition within agriculture, is by Blattner 2020. They describe how just transition has the potential to support the collective empowerment of agriculture and of farmers, and move away from the idea that climate policy and its relationship with farmers is based on antagonism and fear and conflicts between groups. There's also a growing focus on just transition in agriculture in policy, particularly in the Republic of Ireland. The idea of just transition was also central to the idea of a Green New Deal in the United States. What's interesting, though, is that people have argued that just transition or its focus within agriculture in the Green New Deal have been tokenistic, and that it has failed to consider the needs of farmers. Another issue facing just transition, as mentioned with regards to the European Green Deal, is that there is a lack of structure similar to trade unions within agriculture. So when you take, for example, coal mining, workers have representatives through trade unions who could negotiate with decision makers and so forth. That structure isn't as common within agriculture. What is interesting, though, however, is that there could be a potential role for cooperatives in terms of their role of collective empowerment and enhancing the position of farmers within value chains. That is something which I'll talk about a little bit later on. So I'm going to move on now to talk about the idea or the main focus of my PhD study, which has been looking at the potential for the bioeconomy to secure a just transition for beef farmers. I suppose, just out of interest, a quick show of hands, has anyone here ever heard of the bioeconomy? Okay, so a couple, so not too many. So I suppose to start off, to support a transition away from fossil fuels and support a society which is no longer dependent on fossil fuels, changes will be needed to how we make and how we consume goods and products. So this requires a move away from fossil fuels, inefficient waste management, towards a more circular economy where we reuse goods and products. The European Commission defines the bioeconomy as the sustainable production of renewable biological resources and the conversion of resources and waste streams into value-added products. And there's much within academic literature which presents the bioeconomy as a potentially transformative concept. So, referring to the results of a global expert survey, he set out into an overwhelmingly positive picture of the bioeconomy by outlining how it can enhance our basic needs and eliminate social inequalities while also supporting collaboration across borders. A particular focus, particularly within policy documents, is placed on the potential for the bioeconomy to support new opportunities for rural areas, as well as for farmers in particular. So this is due to the potential for farmers to use biomass, so whether that's crops, agricultural waste, in new ways to provide the raw material needed to move away from fossil fuels. While much of academic literature defines the bioeconomy as incoherent, a simple definition is that it represents a transition from fossil-based society to a bio-based society that uses renewable biomass in products and energy. There's been a number of developments within the Republic of Ireland relating to the bioeconomy. So the Republic is, I suppose, an interesting case study for the bioeconomy because it has the potential to provide lessons for other states, but also learn from other states in terms of the bioeconomy's development. So a key, I suppose, year for the bioeconomy's development was 2012. That was when the European Commission began to focus the development, or I suppose maybe take an emphasis from a policy perspective in growing the bioeconomy. Similarly, the Delivering Our Green Potential document was published by the government in the Republic of Ireland, and that outlined the government's commitment to support bioeconomy developments. I suppose around 2017 and 2018, February 2018, the government in the Republic launched the National Policy Statement for the Bioeconomy. And this outlines policy steps which would be taken to look at the feasibility of the bioeconomy within the Republic of Ireland. So that emphasised elements such as creating a network to bring different organisations together that can facilitate the bioeconomy's development. In 2022, the Bioeconomy Implementation Group, which was established by the government in the Republic of Ireland and is co-chaired by the Department of Communications, Climate Action and the Environment and the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marines, sought to highlight the growth of the bioeconomy. These policies, again, similar to the European perspective, underlines the focus on creating new opportunities and supporting the regional economy via the bioeconomy. So while the bioeconomy within policy documents is emphasised as being something which can support a move away from fossil fuels, which can create opportunities for farmers in rural areas, there are a number of criticisms within its development. The first of these is from an environmental perspective. There is the view that the bioeconomy may be simply a rebranding of biotechnology, where natural resources are used to advance economic development without considering what would be the social or the environmental impacts of increasing the use of natural resources. Furthermore, from a socio-economic perspective, there is a view that rural areas could become resource peripheries, whereby they provide the raw materials, but the added value takes place within urban centres, and it's within those urban centres that would benefit most from the bioeconomy's development, rather than actually within the rural areas in need of new income streams. A further area of critique of the bioeconomy is a view that there has been a lack of inclusion within decision making in terms of whose voices are heard and who's the ability to influence how decision makers or decisions are made within the development of the bioeconomy. So referring to the results referring to a study on the German bioeconomy, there's a view that dialogue with the public refers to creating acceptance, which is acceptance for decisions which have already been made, rather than real democratic participation and active involvement in shaping the bioeconomy. As the study by Museletti describes, focusing on bioeconomy development in Finland, but also referring to the German bioeconomy, they describe how this lack of inclusion can lead to skepticism of the bioeconomy and distrust towards those responsible for its development. And this can ultimately hinder the successful development of the bioeconomy in terms of supporting farmers' involvement within the bioeconomy. And again, at the European level, there's been the criticism that public relations have focused on one-way information transmission rather than communities and groups such as trade unions, environmental NGOs, and farmers having the ability to have their voices heard in terms of how the bioeconomy will be developed. One area, I think it leads into that in terms of who's the ability to have their voices heard within the bioeconomy and how that influences how the bioeconomy is developed, is the view that there is no one singular idea of what a bioeconomy is. One of the most widely cited papers on the bioeconomy is a study by Bush et al. From 2016, and that describes three understandings of the bioeconomy. So the first understanding is a biotechnology understanding of the bioeconomy, which focuses on using technologies to maximize the use of natural resources in terms of maximizing profit and so forth. The second vision is a bioresource vision, which is quite similar in terms of it emphasizes the use of resources to create products for to replace fossil fuels. Then the final vision is a bioecology vision, and that emphasizes the need for a greater level of sustainability in terms of protecting biodiversity, habitats, and so forth. Other papers have looked at more of a duality in terms of a technical economic bioeconomy and a regional environmentalist bioeconomy. So as you can see, the vision on the left here is one which aligns with REIT sustainability, which emphasizes economic sustainability rather than social and environmental sustainability. On the other hand, regional environmentalist bioeconomy focuses on ensuring that environmental well-being is not placed behind economic well-being. Similar to what I mentioned in terms of incremental just transition and transformative just transition, the technical economic bioeconomy really emphasizes moving from a fossil-based economy to a bio-based economy without considering changes to economic or value chain structures, as well as structures relating to governance. In terms of who has the ability to have their voices heard, the technical economic bioeconomy focuses or views farmers simply as biomass suppliers, whereby farmers supply biomass and that is the end of their role within the bioeconomy. On the other hand, there is a focus on a need for a greater involvement of the local types of knowledge which are held by farmers. So rather than depending on technology and maybe expert opinions alone, a greater focus must be placed on the localized environment, the localized economy, in terms of utilizing the knowledge and the views which farmers have on how best to use land within their local environments. I want to move on now to the focus of my PhD study. So the primary research question on my study is, what are measures which could support the entry and involvement of beef farmers into the bioeconomy in order to support a just transition? So alongside this, there is a consideration of what exactly would the role of farmers be in the bioeconomy, to what extent has their knowledge been considered within bioeconomy developments, and how can the farmers ultimately benefit, both economically, but further beyond solely economics, from the development of the bioeconomy. To answer this broad research question, my study focuses on 4 sub-questions. So these 4 sub-questions, I suppose, represent the focus of the 4 final chapters of my research study. The first 3 questions, papers based on these sections, have all been published. The first paper was published in Cleaner and Circular Bioeconomy. The second paper was published in Sustainability. And the final paper was actually published last night in Journal of Rural Studies. So for the next few minutes, I want to talk about the three papers which I've published, as well as providing a brief overview of the final chapter of my thesis. So as I mentioned, one of the criticisms of the bioeconomy is the view that it has not been sufficiently inclusive in terms of who has the ability to have their voices heard and who can influence how the bioeconomy will be developed. One starting point to understand, well, first of all, who is involved in the bioeconomy and who has their voices heard or who's influencing how the bioeconomy will develop, is the use of social network analysis. So social network analysis is a good way for understanding who's involved within the development, how are different organizations connected together, and how might this influence policy measures and development paths. So social network analysis can be used to identify who is present within the network. It can also describe who is not within the network, so who are marginalized, who are excluded, and how might that impact how decisions are made. A further benefit of social network analysis is that it can help to identify brokers. So these are organizations, as you can imagine, who can help to provide information to groups, who can help to connect groups together, and who can support the flow of knowledge and information throughout networks. So as you can see on the graphic here, this was from a paper which looked at bioeconomic development in Colombia. So the focus of the first chapter of my research study was to try and develop something along these lines to see who was involved within the bioeconomy. To undertake this, I conducted a content analysis of 22 policy documents from Irish and European bodies dating from 2012, which, as I mentioned, was one of the starting points for the bioeconomy. So the focus of this was to look at who the organizations who were involved, who was connected together, and given that my paper or my PhD is focusing on beef farmers, to what extent are beef farmers involved in the bioeconomy? So this graphic here represents the map of the Irish bioeconomy social network as of 2020. So as you can see, there's a lot of lines and a lot of circles. The bigger the circle means the more connections those organizations have. So as you can see on the top right, there is a color-coded approach. So the green represents government bodies. So that one represents the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine in the Republic of Ireland. Semi-state entities are like Teagasc, the Agricultural Food Development Authority, Enterprise Ireland, the Environmental Protection Agency, and so on. Yellow represents academic bodies, so University College Dublin, Trinity College, University College Cork. Brown represents primary producers, so to what extent are farmers involved. Grey are businesses moving into the bioeconomy. Purple are new developments which have, I suppose, come about because of the bioeconomy's developments. And orange then is local government bodies and representative bodies also. So in terms of who is here within the network, as you can see, government bodies, semi-state bodies, and academia and research have been to the core of the bioeconomy's development within the Republic of Ireland. Something which is of note is that there were relatively few examples of businesses moving into the bioeconomy. I'll speak a little bit more about that in a moment. As well as that, there are very few examples of farmer bodies or primary producers present within the bioeconomy as described within policy documents. So there was only one example of what you might call a farmer-oriented body. So that was, if you can see, kind of at this triangle here on the top left, from biorefinery glass, you can see the top Harrahill cooperative. So that was a dairy cooperative which was based in West Cork, and they were involved in the bioeconomy through their involvement in an initiative called Biorefinery Glass, which I'll speak about in a few moments. Another interesting point, if you look at the bottom right, you can see that there's a little cluster here, which I call the mountain cluster. So this consists of a number of agri-food businesses and new bioeconomy developments which are taking place in County Monaghan. So the Bioconnect Innovation Centre is a research and development centre in County Monaghan, and biomarine ingredients is a marine-based biorefinery. What's interesting here is the important role of Monaghan County Council that had connections with different organisations, such as BioRic, which is the National Bioeconomy Research Centre, as well as CRAE, which is an anaerobic digestion association, and other bodies through their involvements in research projects. So that shows how Monaghan County Council, because it had connections with those other organisations, that they can act as a broker for supporting the flow of knowledge and the flow of information into those businesses in County Monaghan. So as I mentioned, I started working on this study in January 2020, and you know what happened in March 2020. So that meant that I wasn't able to use other sources of information, such as semi-structured interviews, in terms of providing more information in terms of how those connections came about, certainly what else that those organisations are connected to. But my final findings chapter has used qualitative research methods to help grow the network to understand 2020 to 2022 who has been able to gain access to the bioeconomy. As I mentioned, the second findings, or the second focus of my research study, was to understand what are the experiences of farmers who have become involved within the bioeconomy. And as you can see, the only example of that was from Harrahill Cooperative. And they were able to gain access to the bioeconomy by participating in the Biorefinery Glass initiative. So the focus of the second part of my research study was to understand what were the experiences of farmers involved in the bioeconomy initiative, such as Biorefinery Glass. So Biorefinery Glass was an EIB Agri initiative which consisted of 5 partners. There was the Institute of Technology in Tralee, which was focusing on the bioeconomy, University College Dublin through their School of Agriculture. There was Harrahill Cooperative, which is a co-op, as well as Kieran Group, which is an agri-food business located in West Cork, and Grassa, which was a Dutch refinery manufacturer. So as you can see on the image on the top left, this was a Grass biorefinery. So Grass was passed through the machine, and you can see the output from Grass in a lump here. And the outcome of passing through this machine is that the proteins from Grass was extracted. What that meant was the protein could be used in other areas, such as in pharmaceuticals. It could be used as a replacement for soya in monogastric feed. And one of the main benefits of that is that even after the protein had been extracted from the grass, the feeding quality for the herd had actually been retained. And you can see an image here in terms of how the grass is broken down, and there are a number of outputs. So the focus of this second part of my research study was to understand what exactly was the role of farmers within this initiative. Was it the case that, similar to bioeconomy development in other locations, the role of farmers was simply to provide the grass and that was it? Or was there a role for their knowledge in terms of influencing how the bioeconomy can be developed? In terms of some of the findings, And the primary responsibility for farmers was the provision of biomass, similar to bioeconomy initiatives in other jurisdictions. Farmers spoke of how their local knowledge was included in certain areas of the project, such as relating to, I suppose, the practicalities of the project in terms of how to run, what kind of machinery would be needed to support it. But there were other areas where farmers viewed that their knowledge could have been of assistance. So that related to areas such as the amount of energy which was being used in the running of the biorefinery. One quote which I think was really interesting, and I think it's similar to another famous quote, is that one farmer described how initiatives like this have the potential to make agriculture exciting again. They spoke of how, for a lot of younger farmers, there is obviously the challenges which farmers are facing, but that initiatives like biorefinery blocks could be a way of creating new income streams for farmers and could be something which would interest young farmers. One interesting aspect is that the project took place in West Cork in the Republic of Ireland, which is a very intensive dairy area. So there was the view that this would not work really well in that kind of region, but when you look at other places such as the west of Ireland, which is more extensive agriculture, that could be something which would help to create new income streams for farmers in need of new income streams. Another aspect which is of interest is when I spoke with the person who led this initiative, they described how one of the reasons why they partnered with West Cork is that there was a cooperative structure in place whereby the researcher could go to the co-op, tell them about what their process was, and that they would be able to bring farmers together. Whereas if it had been applied in an area which is more of a beef area, it meant that it's more individualistic. You don't have those structures in place, so it would have been more difficult to run a project like this. So I suppose what was one of the great things about that is my focus had been to look at beef farming as my PhD continued, but the findings from this study really underlines the relevance of the bioeconomy to beef production within the Republic of Ireland. So that led then to the third findings chapter of my study. So the focus of this section of my research study was to understand, are beef farmers aware of the bioeconomy? What exactly does it mean to them? And so to take this, I used a research method called a biographic narrative interpretive method. So while I spoke with farmers and researchers in the preceding paper using semi-structured interviews, biographic narrative interpretive method is a different type of interviewing method. It focuses on the lived experiences and I suppose the moments which have impacted farmers or people in general have impacted their lives. It is different from other interviewing methods because it's broken into two sections. Within the first section, the interviewer asks the participant a single question. So it's a very much a wide-ranging question which focuses on developing a narrative. So it focuses on what are the moments which have impacted your lived experience. So while that interview session might last between 5 minutes and 20 minutes, the second part of the interview then focuses on particular incidents which farmers emphasize as being important. And from that, you can develop a narrative which really, I think, elicits the lived experience of farmers in terms of what has been important to them within their lived experience and how can we, I suppose, learn from that. One of the elements of Banana interviews is that they tend to have very small interview cohorts. So within this study, there were 6 interview participants. So as you can see, there was a mix between farmers from the west of Ireland and Kerry in the southwest of Ireland. There was differences in terms of age, in terms of gender, in terms of educational attainment and the types of farming practices which they have. I suppose in terms of what have been the primary findings of the study is that of the 6 farmers interviewed, only 1 spoke in depth about what the bioeconomy is, while another farmer spoke about activities relating to bioeconomy. So that would be something like anaerobic digestion. What was really central to the lived experience of farmers is the impact that power imbalances have upon their lives. So there was 3 kind of elements which farmers emphasized. So it was prices, policies, and processors. So whereby farmers feel that they have little power in influencing the price which they receive for their produce, and that contributes to the economic unviability of the beef sector. As I mentioned in the last chapter in terms of the role of cooperatives, another concept which is very relevant to cooperatives was the view that producer organizations, where farmers come together for the collective buying and selling of their goods or their produce, could be something which could enhance the positioning of farmers in the bioeconomy. So that means ensuring that the bioeconomy with consideration for power dynamics does not replicate their experiences in the beef sector, whereby they are price takers and not price makers. So this again highlights the potential for cooperatives or organisations like producer organisations to enhance the role of farmers within the bioeconomy. The final paper of my PhD, which I'll talk about briefly, looked at what could be actions which support the entry and involvement of beef farmers into the bioeconomy. So again, to get, I suppose, further insight into the perspectives and the awareness of farmers relating to the bioeconomy, 21 farmers were interviewed to build upon the previous findings. Furthermore, interactive workshops were held with agricultural advisors in Teagasc, in the Republic of Ireland, and with policymakers such as the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Environment in the Republic. In terms of what have been some of the main findings, there are 3 areas where supports are necessary. So the first of these is in the area of finance, in terms of being able to provide farmers with support to either set up new organisations like cooperatives or to participate in new value chains. Alongside this is the importance of information supports. So that might come from peer-to-peer learning, it might come from trusted sources of information, so that might be agricultural advisors, it might come from support from agricultural media, it may come from schemes which farmers are already participating in. And then the final focus was looking at structures. So how would farmers be positioned within these new value chains? So to wrap up today's discussion, I want to talk briefly about the work which I'm now doing with TASC. So TASC is a think tank for action and social change, and we are working on a concept or an initiative called the People's Transition. The intention of the People's Transition is to understand how can we build support for climate action. And one means of achieving this is by addressing community needs and developmental challenges. So as we know, between the cost of living, between the cost of housing, issues with healthcare, there are a number of challenges facing communities throughout the island of Ireland. And with all of these challenges, there is a risk that the wider issue of climate change may be left behind because people are also more concerned with trying to get to the end of the week. The quote, after thinking about it from the Yellow Vest protest in France, that we are concerned about the end of the world, we are concerned about the end of the week. So we need to consider what are the localized challenges which people are facing, and how can we develop climate solutions which address those challenges as well. So the idea of the People's Transition is to develop a bottom-up framework for climate action, whereby we build support and we build capacity within communities in order for them to be able to take ownership over the transition to a low carbon or a net zero society. And central to this as well is ensuring that climate action isn't just seen as something which comes from the top down, but is something which can come from the bottom up. In terms of how the People's Transition works, there are 3 phases within the project. So the first phase is a mapping phase where we look at census data, we look at local government reports to understand what might be initial needs facing communities. So I suppose one example I would use is the first community I've been working with is a town in the southeast of Ireland called Enniscorthy. So in 2016, the unemployment rate in Enniscorthy, in the centre of the town, was about 1 in 3. So employment was clearly an important need there. Alongside that, it's a town which has been impacted by flooding. It's a town which is impacted by air quality and pollution. So you can see how there's an overlap between addressing people's lived experiences, what are their challenges, and the need to address aspects relating to climate policy and the environment more broadly. So the second point then is we looked to undertake dialogue and engagement within community members, and central to this is looking at who might be organisations who are on the ground who communities are connected with. So that might be, for example, sports teams, it could be churches, it could be schools. So these are locations where people really meet and interact with one another. So through undertaking focus groups, and interviews and surveys, we seek to understand what are challenges which communities are facing. One point I think which is always important to mention is we don't go in by talking about sustainability or climate change, because that kind of language might be off-putting to people. So it's very simple. We ask, what do you appreciate most about your local area? What do you like about your local area? What are challenges and what do you think might be lacking from your local area? From the information we gather, we then look to develop and focus in on 2 solutions which we think could address those community needs. In terms of how the project has developed over recent years, the idea of the People's Transition was conceived by my predecessor, Sean McCabe, who wrote an excellent report in 2020. Following the publication of that report, TASC was supported by AIB to apply the people's transition within two communities. So as I think you can just see from the images there are two very different areas. So the picture you can see on the top is a community called Phibsborough. So that's about 10 minutes north of Dublin city centre, so a very urban community. Then the second area is Harrahill, which is a small village on the western coast of County Donegal. So as you can imagine, both communities had a number of different challenges. So within Phibsborough, the age of housing was a massive issue. It's I think probably 1800s is the housing stock. So it's poorly retrofitted. So of course, energy would be a massive issue there. There was also issues with traffic as well as issues around employment as well. In Harrahill, there was, given that it's a community in the west of Ireland, the lack of job opportunities for younger people in the community was a massive issue. As well as that, there was a great pride in the, I suppose, the cultural heritage of the area. It's a coastal community, so it had great ties there. In terms of the communities or the solutions which were developed within Phibsborough, the two ideas was a retrofit cooperative and a bicycle courier cooperative. So these would have to address the issue of housing, the issue of traffic, as well as the issue for employment. What's been great about the Phibsborough case study is that a couple of different organisations led by Bohemians Football Club alongside Mountjoy Prison, I think the Technological University of Dublin were also involved, as well as a couple of community groups. They were successful in receiving government funding to set up the climate cooperative at a sum of €500,000. So the ultimate ambition for that is to go about developing the retrofit cooperative. Within Harrahill, there was a focus on creating a biochar cooperative, as well as looking at a seaweed farming business, which would include a profit share. So that meant that the community would receive 30% of profits from that business. Community members were sceptical about that idea in terms of a profit share, as there was, I suppose, a great level of interest in the idea of a cooperative. I know that community at the moment have more been focusing on looking at more day-to-day things like energy efficiency and so on. But I think that the idea of the people's transition is that it helps to promote these conversations. Last year, my colleague Roisin Graney applied the idea of people's transition in a cross-border study. So this consisted of 6 communities across Fermanagh, Cavan and Leitrim, and looked at what are, again, challenges that both communities or communities both sides of the border might be facing. So again, similar to Harrahill, there was a lack of sustainable employment for young people. There was issues with energy bills, as well as issues with pollution in Loch Macneil, which is, I suppose, a water body which connects all these communities together. So the idea which has been developed in the cross-border area is a geothermal cooperative, which would have to create employment, have to address issues with housing or with energy. And TASC is currently engaging with a couple of different partners, including members of Queen's University Belfast and Codema, which is the Dublin's energy agency, to look at progressing this area as a pilot location for geothermal energy on the island of Ireland. In terms of the next steps, TASC are delighted to be backed and working with AIB over the next 3 years on applying the people's transition. Over the next 3 years, we will work with 30 communities across the island of Ireland. And as you can see on the map here, we have the 10 communities for the first year. So we have a wide range of communities. So we'll be working with Bangor in East Belfast. I suppose linked to what I've been working on within my PhD, I'll be working on a project with Roscommon farmers. So Roscommon is a county in the west of Ireland, which is very agricultural. And I'll be focusing, undertaking focus groups with farmers from around the county to understand what are challenges which they're seeing from agriculture, from their perspective, as well as what could be solutions. What is great is in June of next month, or at the end of next month, we will have the first launch of this section of the People's Transition in Enniscorthy in County Wexford. So our ambition really from this project is to engage with people from across the island of Ireland to understand what are the different challenges which people are facing, what are the different needs, and hopefully to develop networks across the island of Ireland in terms of if there is a solution which someone sees, say for example in Kilcormac in the Midlands, which might be relevant to another community on our island, that we will be able to connect those groups together to build support, to build capacity. And I suppose one thing which comes up a lot when I spoke with groups is that many reports have been written in the past and they've just been left on the shelf. So it is about building trust in terms of ensuring that communities can benefit and that climate action can enhance the quality of life in communities across the island of Ireland. So I suppose just in terms of turning up, I'd like to thank Queen's University and the Centre for Sustainability, Equality and Climate Action for providing me with the opportunity to speak about the research which I've conducted within my PhD, as well as what I'm looking at now in TASC. In terms of the primary focus of just transition for agriculture, something which has really come out from the research which I've undertaken is the need to ensure that climate action cannot replicate the power imbalances which farmers are facing in terms of their positioning as price takers and not price makers. If climate policy is being viewed as something which is coming from government decision makers in Dublin, where communities feel that they are detached from, who feel that they don't have a voice, who feel like they're being told what to do rather than having input, that would lead to the potential, as we've seen in communities, for politicians who are climate skeptic, who say that climate action is going to cause more difficulty to your lives. The idea of a just transition is to provide, I suppose, an alternative perception whereby if we bring people together, if we look to see what are initial challenges which communities are facing and develop solutions which address those community needs while also having a positive environmental impact, that can help to build support for climate action. I suppose in terms of my own findings from the PhD, something which has been interesting throughout the 4 findings chapter has been the role of cooperatives in terms of helping farmers to gain access to the bioeconomy and also ensuring that farmers can benefit from the bioeconomy. So that leads to the possibility, and of course, while trade unions in many areas are well established, there is perhaps a difficulty whereby, such as in the beef sector, where there isn't that tradition of cooperatives, that it may be difficult to actually create those structures in the first place, that if farmers are supported to come together, their position with value chains can be enhanced and that they can benefit more, I suppose, ultimately have a sustainable income, which can help keep farmers sustainable. Because taking the New Zealand case study, whereby if smaller farms are not sustainable, that land may then be used for absolute, which have a greater or more detrimental environmental impact. So there is a need to focus on both climate action on the one hand, but also the day-to-day needs in terms of addressing the challenges which farmers are facing. So finally, in terms of people's transition, the ambition is to understand from places like Ballymacarrt on the Lower Newtown Ards Road to places like County Roscommon among farmers, how can we develop climate solutions which address community needs and which build support for climate action while also empowering communities. So again, thank you all, and I'd be delighted to take any questions that you have.
Great, thank you, Kieran. Would it be possible to have a copy of the for people who want the waterfall? So yeah, plenty of time for questions or comments, including keep an eye online if anyone any questions there. So who'd like to begin? Otherwise, I have loads of questions.
So the whole presentation is very interesting, thank you. It's premised on the assumption that we carry on with the same political economy governance structure that we have, and we're trying to get farmers to do different things. It might be carbon credits or matching up their grass or using something different. But it's actually there's an element in the room that the farming, the livestock industry causes all this pollution. And so my question is, where is the space for actually affecting change in policy? Because you're talking about these sort of the web diagrams with all these different actors in them, but I didn't see any mention of the progressive farmers groups, the sort of La Via Campesina affiliates, Talabio, Irish Agroforestry Forum, Farming with Nature, the kind of the place where there are innovators who are not part of this mainstream elitist establishment politics. And then the question, this question around how do you engage with these progressive farmers? Because presumably those progressives who innovate already are going to be part of that change. And then how do you connect to the political parties? I mean, in the South, you have Soc Dems, you have the People Before Profit, you have non-establishment parties who maybe engage in agriculture in some way or another. But is it surely with these projects, it's important to get these parties at the table from the start? Because in Northern Ireland, we have progressive political parties like the Green Party, like the Alliance Party, like People Before Profit, who are not especially well engaged in building movements and positively working on visions with innovating farmers. They seem to be more interested in banning hunting and kind of things which are adversarial to the rural communities. So I suppose my question, the final bit of the question is, Ballymaccarrot was what featured. There isn't much farming goes on in Ballymaccarrot, but if you went another 5 miles out, there are actually things, sort of fledgling initiatives going on in Hollywood, connecting with growers and farmers, and North Down and Ard. So I think, is there scope? My question really is there scope in your TASC projects at the next stage to engage with other stakeholders? Because there are other people innovating, there are farmers. Not many, not enough. There are people working in growing and food production who are innovating, who are not part of this vision for more neoliberal capitalist economics, more cooperative movements, more perhaps left-wing other approaches to organising the world. I mean, how do you see that? And is there scope to work 5 miles further east from Ballymaccarrot as your project goes forward?
Yeah, absolutely. And I was actually on the lower Ards Road there saying I saw a tractor drive down the road. So you never know until you started something. I suppose first of all, when you think about, say, the community groups to get involved, so TASC is a part of the Just Transition Alliance in the South. So that consists of a couple of different organisations like Irish Economics Trade Union, SIP2, Friends of the Earth, Stop Climate Chaos. So I think that there would definitely be an initiative in terms of trying to bring those different organisations together, as you mentioned. So one example, last week I was in Petrol Common, where that project in agriculture, and I was speaking with members of MACRA, which is a young farmers organisation. We had an event with the Irish Farmers Association as well. And on Thursday, I'll be meeting with a group of Farming for Nature in South Common. So again, I suppose sometimes when we look at kind of the conversation in terms of agriculture and the environment, there's only certain kind of perspectives which might be considered in terms of maybe more conventional types of agriculture. So I think that networking is important in terms of trying to bring, like Todd, a few of the different groups you mentioned, in terms of trying to bring those together. And it is, I think, a case of collective mobilisation in terms of, while especially in the South at the moment, there are talks of a new rural political party being established, and that party is very much taking the, I think someone, a conservative columnist, said it would be pro-car, pro-meat, anti-woke, which is the perspective it's looking at. So I think, as you mentioned there, in terms of being able to provide that alternative viewpoint in terms of it's not simple that some farmers just want to produce, because at the end of the day, for many farmers, producing what they're doing isn't making sense because they're actually losing money. So I think that there is scope for organisations to engage, I suppose, to present an alternative perspective. And I suppose by finding that alternative perspective, there may be the ability to influence decision making in terms of, while certain farmers may have a certain perspective, it is not representative of agriculture in the Republic entirely, because that there may be benefits for farmers too. And when you look at things like fertilizer prices, for example, the impact that is having on farmer sustainability, whereby if you had a more sustainable approach to fertilizer, if you had a reduction in costs that farmers have to face, it would be beneficial both for the environment but also for the farmers' income as well. I suppose then in terms of the second point, in terms of looking at other communities, our ambition is to try and work with one community in every county and all 32 counties over the next few years. So the cross-border project consisted of 3 counties between Fermanagh, Fermanagh, and Leitrim. So Ballymaccarrot, which is County Down, we'll be working in Limavady next year as well. So there is scope for our communities in Antrim, Tyrone as well. So very interesting, I suppose. As I mentioned, the hope is that learnings which we find somewhere like Roscommon might be very relevant for other communities, and then learnings from Ballymaccarrot might be very relevant for communities in the South as well. So I think that our hope is to try and develop a network where people can learn from what's taking place across the country.
So thanks, Kieran. I was really pleased to see the attention that you have paid to the participative side for farmers in this dialogue. I think traditionally we've been very good as environmentalists at looking at the environmental narrative and farmers from the economic perspective. The social side has been largely overlooked in a professional way. It's kind of been given the nod. And anything you read about adaptation has a huge section on behavioural adaptation. And that's an area where, through my work with Northern Ireland Environment Link and the Rural Resilience Project, and workshops with 75 participants, farmer participants across Northern Ireland, has really come out as important. And findings have really revealed that all farmers, pretty much, I mean, the vast majority, recognise and acknowledge, and many interested in, the fact that the environment is crucial to sustainability of farming. But the dialogue in getting to that point, and the language and the participation and inclusivity is so important. So I was really pleased to see that attention, and I think in Northern Ireland, the recognition of behavioural adaptation is really important. Going forward with this project, we have a stakeholder group with agri-sector leaders from UFU, Delph Farm, AgriSearch, DERA, all your usual suspects, and CAFRE, Rural Support, which is a very important support organisation for farmers' well-being, around the table with some environmental organisations to look very specifically at that change and behavioural adaptation. So that was just kind of first thing that I think we need to focus on here some more. The second one was about the wider dialogue around food and food policy amongst consumers. So it's easy to beat the farmers but want the food they produce. And this wasn't the focus of the project, but it spilled over into this area about consumers' understanding of the role of farmers and what it costs to be sustainable and have sustainability credentials. I feel there's a whole communications piece around that for farmers to feel understood in what it takes in terms of investment and models of good practice to enable them to get to a point to even consider sustainability. So those are just two things that are coming out of our project, and I'd like to know some more details.
Yeah, absolutely. That's brilliant. As again, from focus groups, I've been undertaking this part of the last common ethical transition. It's only two separate focus groups that nearly the exact same thing. We're about maybe 20, 30 years ago, people were spending 25 to 30% of their income on farm, whereas now it's about 9%. So there is definitely that disconnect. And see, for example, I think over the weekend, I think in the Republic Little said that they were reducing their cost of their milk because there had been reductions in the cost of production for farmers. Needless to say, farmers weren't too happy about that because it means that they will be impacted by a reduction in price, even when issues like fertilizer, like meal and so forth, that they are facing those challenges. So I think it's something which is very interesting to touch on in terms of, I remember the very first interview I conducted for my PhD was with a Dutch professor, actually, and he spoke of how in Holland, kids just think food comes from a factory. They don't understand what is the whole process of what the farmer does, what are the practices that go in. So I think that element, is something which would be very interesting, because I suppose the conversations I've had with farmers is that kind of perspective where they think that they're not being heard, they're not being listened to. So I suppose enhancing public awareness of what exactly farmers do. Obviously, we know the impact that climate has on the environment, and the changes will be needed as well. But I think even just kind of respect is something which kind of needs to be built in terms of trust between farmers and consumers as well.
I mean, there's an opportunity in a way. People forget that one of the key workers during the pandemic were farmers. Not only the health workers that we clap for and so on. So there is a way you can probably build on that. But also, the reality is, and it wouldn't be thanks for saying it, do we pay too little for food? The price we pay doesn't actually reflect the full cost of producing it. Particularly, I was amazed that only 20% of beef farmers are economically viable.
Yeah, and I was actually running folks group last week, and there's ARB sponsor and someone from the ARB who's there as well, and they mentioned how for many beef farmers, in terms of repayments, that money comes from their off-farm employment, from their spouses' employment, not actually from what they produce from their farm. So it is, and take that New Zealand example as well, that if those farms aren't viable, it's likely that that land will be leased for dairy farming, because as one of the folks we've had, an agricultural advisor, for a lot of farmers, it's just easier way to make money, just lease their land, and that's it. So yeah, there is, I thought that what's interesting, obviously, with the idea of the just transition in terms of how farmers can be supported in moving toward more sustainable practice, but also making sure that there are communities where there's a quote from a report from Action Aid, which describes how the move to industrial agriculture in the United States led to the death of rural America. So if those communities, if farms are unsustainable, there's a lack of their income opportunities, those communities unfortunately will just dwindle away.
Just before I have you else in Kildare, does this partly reflect as big farmers that, and because often what's missed out in this whole debate is that there are serious divisions within the farming community between very big farms, often connected into big agri-food processing companies, and then the majority of smaller farmers. So I'm suspecting 20% are viable at the big farmers.
So that 20%, they're just among beef farmers. Okay. So the average income for a beef farmer is somewhere between 10,000 15,000. When you look at the dairy sector in the Republic, completely different. So the average income somewhere, I think, 80 to 100,000. So the thing is, those farms are more located in the south, so Tipperary, Limerick, rather than in the western parts of Ireland, which land quality isn't as good. So I suppose, as you mentioned, when people talk about agriculture, it's a bit like talking about workers. Yeah. You know, there's no comparison for other areas.
I think that a few things I'm thinking again about the disparity of how it's all moving forward across the islands. And you've got, for example, in GB, they're moving to that public money for public goods model. So when you're talking about you paying a fair price for your food, you know, if it's public subsidies, government money, tax money going into that there, you know, if it's for a public good, then you get a public subsidy, which I think is the right way to go as well. But we're not adopting that here in Northern Ireland. And then Brexit, that has happened, so we have no agriculture policies, no agriculture act in Northern Ireland. So we're sitting at a bit of a precipice, I suppose, where you can take either view, depends whether you want to be Pollyanna or not, you know, that we have an opportunity to put good structures in place. We've just got a climate bill through, and within the climate bill, we have the just transition for agriculture. Not a lot of people knew what that meant when they were voting for it. I can assure you, but that was happening, and it's there in law now. So we do have the opportunity to build the framework around that as well. And then when you're looking at agriculture in Northern Ireland, it is so disparate because of the land. So you have, you know, already coastal areas. It's very rocky land, you know, so it would be used through farmers. Landowners, the farmers would be renting that out enough for grazing rather than using it for farming. And then you go to the lowlands and the rich pastures, which would be used for the livestock farming as well. So it's a very different picture in a very small region. And then the dairy sector, of course, is, you know, very deeply integrated right across the whole island. That's an all-island economy going on there. So I do think that we'll have a lot of potential when you're rolling out these projects, the people's transition, that, you know, it has to be that bottom-up approach. So developing what looks good in your border regions as opposed to along the north coast, as opposed to, you know, Ballymacarrick is a real inner city. It's not surrounded by the Belfast Hills and farmers, for example, you know, so they are part of that community as well. And building all that into what a community-led plan would be. And I suppose the fact that first question about engage political parties, the engage political parties by making a voting matter. You know, local communities are telling you, if you want our vote, here's our plan, invest in us, and that's how you start to create that shift as well. But there was just no comment, sorry. But my question was go back to the bioeconomics, and I was googling it there, so we're talking about it as well. And we're looking at potentially models then of possibly social enterprises, circular economy models starting to come up or be established, where you've got communities producing the energy for agriculture or for food production or those local models. Is that something Am I thinking along the right lines? I want to Google this more.
Yeah, I suppose one of the
Search engine down there.
yeah, so I suppose say from the Republic's perspective, the Department of Agriculture has highlighted how by the end of 2030 they want to have 150 to 200 anaerobic digestion facilities in place. The issue with that is anaerobic digestion sustainable? Is it a case of greenwashing? So that is one of the things. I suppose in terms of our border transition project, the idea of a community-owned anaerobic digestion was one of the ideas. The reason for that is that a lot of effluent and a lot of byproducts were ending up not being. So by having that AD facility in place, that would have that sustainable impact in terms of reducing impact on water quality. So when you look at the idea of the bioeconomy, there's a focus on moving away from fossil fuels and bio-based products, which is excellent. But like so many issues, there is the argument: is this going to be, the next phase of capitalist accumulation? Is it just going to be the case of it's going to be about maximizing production or impacting the sustainability impacts? So that is one vision. The other vision is that by taking a community-owned approach, that there'll be a greater focus on community needs, community issues. One area of interest is, for example, and it's a different sector, is wool production. So wool among sheep farmers in the west of Ireland is actually a liability. It costs them more to actually shear sheep than it does to actually sell the wool. So, which again is a brilliant example. Previously there had been obviously wool production and where wool could be sold. So there is, I think, in New Zealand and even Wales, I think wool is being used to provide insulation. So that's an area where we take byproduct from farming, you use it for something which can help to improve insulation and improve energy. So it is those kind of things of using byproducts in ways that are sustainable, but ensuring that it isn't just a case of trying to maximize output at the potential cost of the environment.
Yes, I have a question online here from Sean Shanaher, who said, what do you see as the place of new incentives structures for ecosystem services, such as those being trialled in Burren Bio or BEO and Atlantic Life, etc.?
Yeah, I have to be honest, I'm not overly aware of Burren Bio and the work that's been taking place there. I suppose one of the things, maybe it's not so relevant to incentives, but from one of the focus groups I had there in Roscommon, there's the view that farmers want a fair price rather than subsidies, because subsidies impact the market, whereas if they had a fair price, they would be less dependent on subsidies. As well as that, I suppose there's that dependence on off-farm employment as well. I think something which is very interesting, there's a program here at the ground in the Republic of Ireland, an agriculture focused program. And I remember there was one person talking about, carbon payments, how they can't see physically a carbon payment, and if people are, young people in particular, they are to get interested in agriculture, they actually need to see things happening. So, well, I think if it's a case that they can help to support, say, for example, ecosystem protection, obviously there's a great rationale for that. But I think among farmers, there is the feeling that they don't just want to be applying for things on a computer, they want to actually be working. So whether that is something like the bioeconomy, where there's, for example, the fast production crops where they're actually doing something that is, I think, among farmers more their interest rather than dependence on subsidy. But again, I think where it is practical, where there's a clear kind of financial benefit, where farmers, where I suppose agriculture is not viable or possible, and obviously I think that there is definitely a role for that.
And that's what I think, really important that you put up the issue of the coal mining communities, opposed to your question, the social, that it isn't just about the economic viability of the work, it's the pride, it's the identity, it's the sense of, artistic achievement, but there's something more than just the economic dimension of it, and that identity constitutive dimensions of farming, I think is completely missed out if it just says a technocratic top down. And you see this, coal miners, big in the north of England, you even see it in popular films like Brastow. There's been a whole community, of culture, of music, of pride, and it's similar in our rural community. So simply saying, we're not going to pay you to produce beef and dairy. Here's a similar amount or more for sequestering carbon. What does that look like from the farmer's point of view? When, the money is great, but actually the pride, the achievement, the identity. And that you see that absolutely with the coal mining communities. You know, you cannot replicate a coal community on low carbon energy. That's just a reality. So what then do we replace that with? Anyway, I don't have any thoughts on that.
I suppose just on that point, I remember seeing there's candidates for the Labour Party somewhere in the north of England said that I'm proud that my great grandfather was a coal miner. It just kind of shows how they're very removed from coal community, but also that kind of attachment as well about what it meant to be from that region, and how I suppose a bit like agriculture that it is kind of integral. Just say, for example, in Roscommon, I was at a focus group, and one person described how there is a breed of sheep named after Roscommon, so there is that kind of cultural attachment that it's a farming county and something which is important to them. And if there is this view that final policies and attack on agriculture without actually showing how those communities will be supported, you might just see that it's, you know, threatening our way of life and so forth. So I think that's why that kind of dialogue piece is integral.
So that's about the co-creation. I mean, farming communities are incredibly resilient and adaptive, always have been. But I still don't know, what does that look like? It sounds good, the bioeconomy, carbon sequestration, but it's that sense of how do farmers then take ownership and control of that and implement it? Yes.
On that point, sorry, Martin with the Good Southwest College. We recently had guest speaker John Gilliland at the college. Yeah, and to address that point, I thought it was very interesting attending that talk because whenever I walked in, I had a certain mindset of that. You know, the amount of carbon that the farming community are blamed for with regards to the farming practices. And during the talk, I was struck by how the use of technology, in that particular case, LiDAR being used in the soil health, nutrient health program, is looking to benefit farmers developing their carbon, I suppose what you call it, the carbon mass or whatever. Yeah, so that they can be seen then that the good practice is then rewarded. And the good practice, as you say, they want to be involved in the farm, but the good practice in that sense is that you can physically map it and see it. And I came out of that, you know, sort of enlightened in a way, because I thought, well, that's putting the technology to good use, and it was quite encouraging. Although he did point out that, you know, the peat soils is obviously a big issue, which I didn't know about, but that there's another, that was sort of put to one side almost, you know. But I thought that it was very interesting the way that scheme has helped to develop that idea, and also then the use of the sampling has sort of backing that up as well. So no, I thought that was good. Just to address what you were
Well, it's very role for the academy. There's lots of data gaps in terms of, as we make this transition, we do need social science research for the type you're involved in, Kieran, but also the hard geophysical. I should like to hear that there's a geothermal element in one of the projects, because Joe Ireland, who is Mr. Geothermal here in the university, is always pointing out the fact that this part of the island of Ireland is blessed with geothermal resources. You know, there is a little bit down south, but mostly it's concentrated around this part of the world.
And Ballycastle direction.
Yes, you know, that gets over a lot of the objections people have against renewable energy, because it's the heat beneath your feet. You don't really see, there will be physical manifestations above ground, but it doesn't have the same impact as wind farms, for example.
Yeah.
You have another question from online. Karis, who said it's a very interesting talk. Does it being from Wales, there's a problem with large companies buying farming land for tree planting schemes and carbon offsetting? Obviously, replanting woodland is important, but then there are problems for farmers who face a loss of land available to them, etc. I wonder if there's a worry that the changes you'd like to see in participation of farmers in policy will come fast enough to protect communities.
Yeah, it's one thing, and actually one focus group I ran, something which came up as well, is that there are companies buying land as part of offsetting their emissions, and obviously the impact of that is farmers will be bidding against companies, and there'll be no competition there. So I think definitely, and I suppose as part of the People's Transition project, it is about that sense of community ownership. So rather than it being a case I suppose kind of goes back to that comment about industrialization is the debt of rural America. If it's a case that you see that their land and even something like County Leitrim has been a massive area of debate, has been the wide scale planting of trees and forestry as well, in terms of people feeling that they have no ownership of their locality or no ability to influence how decisions are made in their locality. So I suppose on our end in TASC, our hope is that by engaging with different communities, publishing reports, hopefully we'll be able to illustrate to rather decision makers, this is the perception of people on the ground. And I suppose it goes back to your point as well there in terms of engaging or bringing different groups together in terms of being able to mobilise against this. I suppose one example is there was the planned work sewer trade deal, and that was another area why there was protests in terms of people feel that they're not being able to, and of course, it's hard when it comes to decision making at a national or European wide scale. So, yeah, I think that is one of the challenges and provides necessity of engaging, bringing environmental groups, trade unions, agricultural organisations together to present that alternative.
It's also about understanding the full supply chain impacts. It's kind of similar to this question of kind of a green extractivism.
Yeah.
It's even more than greenwashing. You just think of electric vehicles.
Yeah.
If you trace the entire supply chain, the conditions under which cobalt, nickel, and so on that are needed for the batteries are often not very human rights compliant environmentally. So a lot of these green sounding ideas, you got to lift the hood on them and say, well, what's actually going on here? Particularly when that wild west of carbon offsetting is particularly worrying because, in a way, I guess Claire would know because she was the lead sponsor of the bill, the whole net zero language itself is problematic. It's not absolute zero. And once you have net zero in there, you can then say, oh, well, we're not going for absolute zero, but sure, we can engage in some other carbon offsetting. Now, don't get me wrong, it would be hard to decarbonise sections of our economies. But that is very rarely understood in terms of the net zero, which is a form of carbon indulgences. That's what led to the Reformation. Is that indulgences in your theological lessons, which where the rich could buy off their sin, and it led then to the develop Martin Luther sticking his theses into the Church of Wittenberg. And yeah, that's what carbon offsetting now is, modern indulgences. Sorry, yourself.
It was interesting. Just wondering, in your work with kind of communities transition to net zero, have you looked at the total carbon footprint of the options? For example, you were talking about the bioeconomy and the biomass, and I don't know if you're aware that methane 390 times more than probably natural gas. The actual combustion of a litre of biogas is 3 times that of the combustion of natural gas. And yet there's so many problems with the environmental impacts, never mind the carbon impacts in terms of the feedstock, the growing of the feedstock for the biomass projects, the change it has on biodiversity, the loss of conifer, and forcing farmers possibly into less favorable areas to farm intensively because the better land is maybe used for feedstock. The doubling of the waste from biomass production. For example, if you're processing 10,000 tonnes of beef slurry, you require 20,000 tonnes in total because you have to add 10,000 tonnes of grass. So you started off with 10,000 tonnes of beef slurry to process, and you now end up with 20,000 tonnes of effluent to put out on the land. That effluent isn't beef slurry. It has been reduced in its dry matter content, so it goes into the water table quicker than the slurry did. So I'm just wondering, in your work with communities, are you looking at the total carbon footprint? Are you looking at the total environmental degradation that could result from the various options?
Yeah, so I suppose just in terms of the PhD research I've been looking at, a member of BioRMIC, which is the National Bioeconomic Research Centre. So while I've been looking at, I suppose, social science perspective in terms of farmers' perspectives, a lot of the research which is being done is looking at life cycle assessment. So, and I think that is, it's great to look at what could be the opportunities for income streams, but you have to consider what would be the environmental impacts because there's no point. I suppose one of the examples which has come up a couple of times, farmers I spoke with, was in the Republic of Ireland. Grant aid had been provided to farmers to sow miscanthus and to sow willow. Now, there's obviously the environmental impacts of that. I suppose from my own research, it was looking at more of a policy perspective in terms of when those decisions were made, the value chain was not developed, which meant that farmers sowed miscanthus and willow, but there was no market for them to sell to in the end. So between, I suppose, the socio-economic perspective in terms of creating new income streams, but also the environmental impacts in terms of ensuring that, I suppose, kind of links with what you mentioned about greenwashing in terms of when you look at ideas which are presented as the alternative to fossil fuels, if they aren't sustainability from start to end in terms of their environmental impacts, then that will result in a loss of trust and will ultimately not have benefits. So in terms of the work with the people's transition, what we've been looking to is to try and develop, I suppose, an initial idea which we think could be actionable and practical. Once we have that idea developed, we look to engage with experts to look at, I suppose, what can be done in terms of feasibility, but also from that environmental perspective as well, what can be done which can be a genuinely sustainable alternative.
It brings to mind, there is work going on here over in the Centre for Advanced Sustainable Energy, looking at development actually of cooperatives of farmers for AD plants. Yeah. And there's part of me that suspects that the gas network in Northern Ireland is very new. And in other words, I think there are other interests that need to be factored in here. You know, particularly the rush to hydrogen is a different issue. But hydrogen is now a major part of the energy transition here in the north, in particular, like down south. And partly it's driven by the fact that the gas industry is shit scared that it would left with all this kit. And because of how new our natural gas network is, it can take a higher proportion of hydrogen and perhaps even biomethane as well. And particularly, you know, it's always struck me as mad. I mean, Claire might have some comment as a former MLA, that the government here in the north has a statutory duty to promote gas in the context of a climate crisis. And of course, you can add in all sorts of biogas. It's, you know, so it fits the. Anyway, I think there's too many convenient like Lego bricks all to fit together, which lead to me to be a kind of a what I would call biofueling the Hummer.
Yeah. So
I'm just going to take out the bad fossil fuel and stick in, you know, maybe questionable in terms of the baseline, but to continue business as usual.
Yeah.
I think that's Deirdre's game plan. Certainly Edmund Goose's. He's not going to preside over a radical agroecological transformation of the North's economy. I mean, this has been recorded. I'm happy to stand up. If my vice chancellor is listening, I have the evidence to back it up. Colin.
Yeah, just for myself on that, actually, I wonder if it came up in your engagement with individuals or communities, that sense of maybe this transition is being kind of forced upon farming and rural communities more generally when they haven't been able to partake in that transition. You know, there have vast swathes of the island have been left behind by the development of gas for the last decades or ever. You know, people are on coal still and largely blamed for that as well. Like, you know, you're still burning the dirty coal, and now you're kind of expected to sacrifice again to move forward. Is that something that kind of turns up in your discussions with people?
Yeah, I suppose in terms of the interviews with farmers, it wasn't integral throughout the interviews. I don't like, say, for example, there was one farmer who spoke about how their local area had been severely impacted by floods. It impacted their local wildlife. There was other farmers who spoke about the green agenda, green interests, and so on, in terms of that perspective that farmers aren't being treated, and that there's a push towards green interests and green policy without considering what is in the interests of farmers as well. I suppose what's interesting about your point about coal is actually the first community working with Enniscorthy. It has one of the worst air qualities in the Republic of Ireland. And the reason for that is its dependence on coal mining, so it's not connected to the gas grid. So there's that dependence. It's an area with high employment areas, say, with lower educational attainment. So it is that example whereby if there is this push to greener types of energy without addressing their challenge if green energy is unaffordable, especially where we're at the moment right now, there is that risk that I don't blame is the right word, but if people aren't able to make that transition and that they're left behind, then that will lead to support for politicians who say, you know, this green, it's a load of nonsense, we'll do whatever. So that's why I think that issue of you need engagement, you need to develop solutions which address community needs, it's really vital.
Where are the Healy ways? behind this, do I give her a roll of card? Anyone who hasn't spoken, like to ask a question or make a comment before we close.
I guess just because I'm doing a master's at the moment and working with Diara to do with the Just Transition Commission. And I guess we're kind of looking at the different actors that would be involved. So we're kind of looking at agriculture as one of the main ones, but then I'm just thinking, are there other ones that I could sort of look at together with them that might share some of the same like perspectives, or they might be able to like come together?
Yeah, I'm trying to think now. I know, just say for example, in the Republic, the area of kind of tea production and so on. So I think probably energy could be one area which might be very relevant. I suppose you could look at maybe areas of manufacturing as well. Could be of interest. Like I know, I think of Just Transition, there's that kind of climate impact, but there's also kind of areas like automation could be another area which is very relevant in terms of where are the job sectors which may be impacted by decline. So I think maybe other areas like land use, like maybe forestry could be probably overlaps as well. There's, I think one of the quotes I shared from Finland was looking at, from a bioeconomy perspective, there were businesses trying to utilize forests in terms of creating biomass to kind of promote economic development without considering what would be the climate impacts as well. So I think probably areas where maybe automation could be relevant in the future, forestry. I know that there is, I think when John McDonald was the Shadow Chancellor, try and promote renewable production or renewable generation in Harrahill and Wolf, East Belfast. So I think those areas could be relevant as well.
Have a chat with me, because there are a number of papers that you may not be aware of that were produced in the last couple of years. One is by one called Aoife Ní Lachlan, who wrote a piece, I think, for TASC, on where she mapped the energy, large energy users in Northern Ireland and the impacts that would have of an energy transition away from fossil fuels. Myself and Sean Kieran, who's another early career, we wrote a paper for the Department of the Economy called Mapping a Just Energy Transition in Northern Ireland. And we actually try to quantify the jobs and so on that would be affected. And of course, then, you know, in terms of people to speak to, it's the environmental groups as well, you know, whether it's Friends of the Earth or NIEL, Northern Ireland Environment Link, who may have, you know, quite a different view perhaps than others. But there certainly is a growing interest, partly because of Claire's bill or the climate change bill now, that the Just Transition is now underway, at least rhetorically, what it actually means in practice. One issue I would suggest you might want to look at, particularly in the course of the summer when you're doing your dissertation, I think we may begin to see the different sectors in the north here beginning to tee up. Because if farmers aren't going to take their fair share of carbon reduction or greenhouse gas reduction, well, does that mean transport has to take up more, or the energy sector? And then I don't know how wide you want to go, and maybe this is the footnote, but there is an ammonia disaster here as well. So not just carbon and greenhouse gas emissions, nitrates, ammonia, and there is some research that has been done on that I could direct you towards. But I think just stick with one disaster at a time. Take off too much, but it's a fascinating area, you know. And as part of the problem we have, though, from a governance point of view, I've always said the problem's in the name, Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs. Why and how will they conjoin together? We should have a separate, you know, energy and climate change, you know, department and so on. We used to have a separate Department of Environment at one stage. I think the problem is the conjoining of those two, and particularly, again, under the bell poots, you can tell which interests are going to be represented. I mean, you can compare also Farmers Union statements for what Evan Coote says and what Farming Today says on BBC Radio Ulster. Simply uncritical issuing of a particular perspective. Anyway, as you can tell, I've got lots of opinion. But anybody, any other last week? Yes.
Do you think food and democratizing food, the idea of food sovereignty, asking people what they want to eat, asking farmers, do they want to go back to producing food rather than commodities? Because at the moment, we talk about this production of food by farmers, but the beef coming from your farm, the dairy coming from all these farms that are pumping out shit all over the countryside, the grain that's being produced to feed the animals isn't food for people in Ireland, north or south, it's commodity for export. Do you think food is and planning of local food, promoting local food democratization might be a way, might be a space really to solve these issues?
Yeah, I think so. I suppose mentioned my predecessor Sean McCabe is working with his football club in Dublin, and they set up a community support agriculture cooperative. I think it's something along those lines. I suppose one thing it's probably going to be slightly different, but in a focus group in Roscommon, one farmer spoke of how years ago there were local abattoirs where farmers would be able to bring their beef out, but now it's so kind of processor driven. I think there may be interest in that area in terms of looking at cooperative in terms of addressing local community food security.
Yeah.
It's something of interest. Again, I suppose you think about the whole kind of value chain as well. One farmer mentioned how it's just not viable to produce, vegetables, carrots, turnips, and so on, because the price at which supermarkets are selling them at, it's just not viable. Whereas if you had that kind of community-focused approach, I think there could be maybe a viability in terms of looking at additional income streams for farmers, as well as food poverty as well, just more broadly as an issue. So I think it could be something of interest. Yeah.
You just ban lost leaders, ban imported food from for human rights, enslaved Africans in Spain and all this stuff. So it wouldn't have to just depend on the cozy CSA local food things, which some people would like, but for the masses in Ballymaclarren, they need cheap food.
Yes.
Yeah. But also I think that in the war in Ukraine now, and who knew how significant Ukraine was in terms of fertilizers and never mind food. Food security has now become a big issue. Never mind then when the middle classes in England were losing their shit because they couldn't get their strawberries from Spain and so on. And you just begin, I think people's eyes are slowly being opened to the dangers of long globalized supply chains that can get disrupted by a pandemic, by severe heat waves and droughts in southern parts of Europe, and therefore relocalizing our food system, not for export, but to feed our own population. And I find it bizarre, because the best potatoes in the world in Comber. And yet when I go to the supermarket, you see Egyptian, Cypriot and so on. What's going on here? Or apples, Armagh, best apples in the world. Anyway, it just seemed to me that there's a bigger discussion around why something that makes economic sense for profitability for a very few large multiples. People forget that our food system at the retail end is dominated by about 6 large retailers. And that means then farmers are in a very difficult position because they're not cooperatively organised. And they are the reasons why the margins for farmers are so small. And, also the reasons why I think with the exception of firefighters and abattoir workers, it's one of the most dangerous professions you can have, and high levels of suicide and mental health because of the stress. So I think that there is the ingredients here of telling a different story around farming, pulling back the veil, let people know. The only reason why you're paying so cheap for your food, it's because the land is being degraded, either here or somewhere else. So I think that food security is a gateway drug to food sovereignty. I think if you go to food sovereignty to figure out you've lost people. But I think food security you begin to get. And on that note, can I thank Kieran for an excellent presentation and yourselves for the discussion, and including yourselves online. So give him a round of applause.